So far this semester, we have provided a framework for why we would want to conduct ecological restoration, and have laid out some basic principles of restoration, including the importance of restoring ecosystem services and applying an adaptive management technique to restoration projects. This week, we're going to drill down a little bit deeper into the restoration process and discuss reference ecosystems, with an emphasis on why we need them and how you go about establishing what the attributes of a reference ecosystem actually is. In this lecture, I want to introduce you to the concept of a reference ecosystem and provide you with some background related to reference ecosystems that will provide the basis for the remaining video lectures in this section. These include better understanding the role of historical ecology and paleoecology in defining reference conditions, the idea of naturalness when we consider restoration, and how we should handle anthropogenic landscapes. So by the end of this video lecture, you should be familiar with what a reference ecosystem is and why they are important for ecological restoration. So you will recall from last week we introduced this graph adapted from the original developed by Tony Bradshaw as a framework on how to think about ecological restoration. And recall that when we restore an ecosystem, we should be focused on restoring both ecosystem structure and function, and that in many ways we can rely on natural processes such as natural disturbances to help restore ecosystems that have been degraded over time. And also remember that there's almost never only one single expression of these ecosystem attributes, meaning structure and function, because there are just too many random events that can influence ecosystem development. Thus, we can consider that there may be some historic range of variation associated with ecosystem development, especially the development of our original ecosystem. So when we think about restoring this degraded ecosystem, we are going to use this historic range of variation associated with the original ecosystem to be our reference state. And we can also link this back to Aldo Leopold, who promoted the idea of a base datum that can guide resource management. And this original ecosystem, or our reference ecosystem, can be considered analogous to what Leopold called his base datum. So we can define a reference state as a model for planning and evaluating a restoration project. This is the target that we are aiming for when we apply different on-the-ground restoration techniques. And to do this effectively, we need to have some sort of mechanism to not only identify the restoration goal, but we need to understand the restoration potential of a site, the specific techniques we will use to restore the site, and a way to evaluate the success of the restoration project. And it is this reference state, or these reference conditions, that allow us to do these four things. So let's look at an example reference ecosystem. So for over about 10 years now, I have been working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to restore mixed pine forests of the northern Lake States region. And as part of this effort, we have been studying old-growth mixed pine forests across the region, similar to this 200-acre stand located on the Hiawatha National Forest in the eastern peninsula of Upper Michigan. And specifically at this site, we have quantified stand structure and composition using a variety of ecological inventory techniques and related these attributes to different environmental factors such as soils, geomorphology, and climate. And we have explored the disturbance history at the site with an emphasis on understanding how wildfires have impacted the structure of these forests, as these are fire-dependent forest ecosystems. The result is that we have a pretty good understanding of ecosystem structure and function at this site and how it has developed over time. And in its simplistic way, what we really have here then is what we could consider a reference state for mixed pine forests of eastern Upper Michigan. We understand the structure, the composition of this actual site. We've quantified it. We have those metrics which we can compare our restored site back to and use as our guide for restoration. There is a problem, however, with only selecting a single site as a reference, like this previous example. Specifically, that one site represents only one single state or expression of ecosystem attributes. And recall that we said earlier that there is this historic range of variation associated with ecosystem structure and function with a specific ecosystem type. And the structure and function represented in the picture on the previous slide reflects only one particular combination of events that have occurred during ecosystem development at that specific site. So similarly, we could assume that a degraded ecosystem that we intend to restore can develop into an array of potential sites, and that any of these potential states is acceptable as restoration as long as it is similar to the potential states that the reference condition could follow along natural processes. Thus, using a simple reference is generally not recommended because it inadequately expresses the diverse range of historic variation associated with the original ecosystem. So with this in mind, we can revise our statement or definition of what reference states or conditions are, and we can define a reference condition in a similar way as Covington et al. Have suggested. Wally Covington and his colleagues have been studying ponderosa pine forests for the last 30 to 35 years and are part of the Ecological Restoration Institute at Northern Arizona University. And they define in this 1997 paper reference conditions as the range of historical or natural variability in ecological structures and processes that reflect evolutionary history, disturbance regimes, and abiotic and biotic conditions. So what we need to do is to think about our reference conditions as a composite description that is assembled from a variety of different sites that represent a range of different conditions of that natural state. So let's go back to the example from the UP of Michigan and our work to restore mixed pine forests. What you see here is the network of study sites that we use to develop reference conditions for mixed pine forests at the Seney National Wildlife Refuge, about a 100 square mile area in the eastern half of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And as you can see, we didn't just rely on one single site. Rather, we studied 50 sites that represented a range of conditions, including some of the best remaining examples of old-growth mixed pine forests in the northern lake states that are located in the Seney National Wilderness area. These sites form the framework of us developing a composite picture of reference conditions for mixed pine forests. And so we did that at each of these sites by reconstructing fire history going back to the early 1600s, and then using dendroecological methods determining how many fires, fire frequency, and inferring from that seasonality of burn, and link this information to data we collected on the composition and structure of these forests through standard ecological inventory techniques. And so what this allowed us to do is not only develop a composite suite of reference conditions in terms of what the typical fire regime looked like on these sites, as well as what the fire history meant for structure and function associated with these forests, but it also allowed us to examine how these forest ecosystems have developed over time following a variety of different anthropogenic disturbances, such as logging and fire suppression. So you can see the kind of current condition that we have here where these mixed pine forests were logged, and you can see a white pine stump here in the foreground with this dense stand of jack pine in the background. That is a condition that's not typical of these reference conditions for mixed pine forests at the Seney National Wildlife Refuge. So absent of going out and collecting a bunch of information in the way that we've done along the lines of these ecological studies, Where might you find information to develop a suite of reference conditions for your restoration project? Well, there are a variety of sources, but at a minimum, you should have information from a baseline ecological inventory that describes the important aspects of the environment and biodiversity, such as species composition and community structure. These should all be, you should have some knowledge of these conditions at the site before you start your restoration plan as part of your baseline inventory. And then you can use a variety of other sources to collect information to develop this composite reference condition for the ecosystem that you're interested in. And in some areas where these ecosystems are the center of other restoration activities, this may have already been done for you. So what are some of these other sources? Well, one would be basic ecological descriptions and species lists and maps prior to the ecosystem degradation or disturbance, as well as similar intact ecosystems that may be nearby. A good example of this that we're studying here at OARDC is an example of a tornado that happened almost 5 years ago that impacted part of the Seacrest Arboretum. We've paired that disturbed site with a stand nearby within half a kilometer away that has similar soils and topography that we're using as a baseline to compare the successional development of that disturbed site following the EF2 tornado to see how closely it parallels the development of that forest that we see that's relatively intact. Another common and really nice data set that you can use to help develop reference condition are going to be historical photographs. Many places have historical photos that date back to the early 20th century, and that there may be time series of photographs that give you an idea of what the stand structure has been and how it has developed over time. And we can infer structural and functional attributes from these historical photos. We also can look at aerial photos as well as ground level photos that can give us a really good idea to reconstruct these conditions of our reference ecosystems. There may be remnants of a site that are very similar to the site that needs to be restored, and that can provide insight into previous physical conditions and biota. All right, so there are numerous examples across the eastern U.S. of small old-growth remnants that may provide some good information that can be used to infer what the potential historic variation may be in your ecosystem that you're trying to restore, in a similar way that we've used these old-growth remnants in the Seney Wilderness area as good examples and the best remaining examples of these mixed pine forests in the UP of Michigan. We can also look at herbarium and museum specimens to give us an idea of what the species mix might have been, and the species composition and biodiversity levels may have been based on previous collections that were made 100 to 150 years ago. These can be really useful from that perspective to reconstruct that species list. There are also many historical accounts and records, some that are more annotations, where individuals were early surveying lands as they moved into them prior to Euro-American settlement, say for instance here in Ohio, and described the environment that they saw prior to it being settled. Or there's more quantitative or quasi-quantitative data sets out there, such as information from the General Land Office or ordnance surveys in the UK that provide ideas about what was actually there. And in many instances, like the General Land Office records, they actually used witness tree data when they were surveying the land for settlement and made note of what they saw. And in fact, we've been able to use a lot of that historical data over the years to develop ideas and make predictions about what the pre-Euro-American composition of our forest ecosystems in the eastern and western United States actually look like by reconstructing these survey records. Obviously, like we've done at the Seney National Wildlife Refuge, there may be ecological research from peer-reviewed literature that you can rely on to find this information as well, and that can be really helpful and really useful to piece together and to add to some of these other data sets that you might have. And then finally, we can go to the paleoecological data and evidence, things such as looking at the dendroecological record, looking at pollen records, and things like that that give us an idea to reconstruct what the past forest or ecosystem community looked like in terms of its composition and structure. And we'll spend more time in another lecture and part of the series this week looking at greater detail at how we can use paleoecological evidence to really help support developing reference conditions for ecosystem restoration. So all of these can be really important sources of information that can help you develop a set of reference conditions for the site that you intend to restore. And it should also be noted that all have potential issues, and it's really critical that you recognize the limitations of each source of information before you use it and to develop this suite of reference conditions for the ecosystem of interest. And so, for example, we can look at, say, the example of old growth remnants and using those as a guide to develop reference conditions. They can provide really nice insight into species-environment relationships, but you really need to take care because to understand why that remnant is actually still there. In some instances, especially here in the eastern U.S., many of these areas that currently exist as old-growth remnants are there and were purposely preserved because they were unique than the surrounding landscape. And so they may not truly be reflective of the historic range of variation that we're trying to capture as part of our suite of reference conditions. In fact, they may be an outlier to that suite of historic range of variation, and we should take care and look into that and use caution from that perspective. Similarly, when we go to the GLO notes and look at other historical accounts, we need to be mindful that some of those descriptions may be biased, depending on who collected that information and who recorded the information and for what purpose was it recorded. So all of these are really good sources of information, and they can provide us with a guide to develop this composite reference condition for our ecosystem of interest. And so these different types of ecological data also represent different spatial and temporal scales, and it's really important that you understand these limitations as well when developing your suite of reference conditions. And so for instance, this figure demonstrates some important differences in spatial and temporal resolution associated with a variety of different data sets that are often used to quantify historical ecological information, right? And so this includes looking at things from very small spatial scales and small temporal scales, such as permanent plots and stand records and forest inventories that may be part of forest management plans, or old planting records as part of land use quantification. So we can consider these to be kind of documentary types of data sets that are going to be collected in individual sites, or we can use remotely sensed data for specific sites that document specific conditions on the ground. Likewise, we can look at historical data that is recorded naturally from a variety of sources, such as tree rings and pollen records, or if you're over at the Bird Polar Research Center on West Campus, you can look at ice cores, for example, which are natural recorders of ecological and environmental conditions on the ground, right? And those typically can span pretty broad spatial scales, but the temporal scale and resolution there maybe much harder to deal with, rather than looking at things such as climatic records where we're collecting data every hour, for instance, or permanent plots where we may be going out every so often on a seasonal basis, if that's the type of information we're collecting. And so you need to keep these things in mind, not only the things that we've talked about on the previous slide, but also how the different data sets that you may be utilizing as part of your tools to develop these reference conditions are going to differ depending on the temporal and spatial scale. So there's a couple of additional things that I think we need to keep in mind with respect to defining reference conditions before we wrap this material up. First thing we need to do is to think about reference conditions from the perspective of what we're trying to gain. And so we often think about reference condition as kind of that late successional expression of development. Our reference condition is going to be that old growth forest out there. It's the endpoint or that late successional description of the ecosystem that we're interested in restoring. And that's what we're going to use as our endpoint for our restoration, or our guide for our restoration. So we often think about the reference condition as this late successional expression of development, right? And so what this means is that it requires us to interpolate back to a prior stage of ecosystem development for the purposes of planning and valuation. We may have some specific information about what the late successional ecosystem looks like, but we may have to infer what that stand or what that ecosystem, its structure and function look like during an earlier stage of development if we're starting from scratch. So let's kind of look at an example here. So if we're going to take the example of restoring a mixed oak forest in southern Ohio in an area that was once farmed and has now been abandoned, what we're going to need to know is how mixed oak forests develop over time, what are the specific factors that really drive their development, and then select an appropriate suite of reference conditions for that specific stage of ecosystem development that our degraded stand is actually encountering through that restoration process. And so what you see here is an example of stand development in 4 different stages that occur after a major disturbance that destroys all or most of the parent stand of a mixed oak forest, where we basically have an area in the stand initiation stage that may be an abandoned pasture land, for example. And then over time, that stand is going to go through a place where you pretty much capture all of the resources. There's going to be very little light, and you end up with what we would consider density-dependent mortality. Over time, those trees will die and shade out. Not all of those individuals are going to live. And over time, there's going to be winners and losers, and eventually those winners are going to die, which then means that we have gaps in the canopy, it opens up, or maybe we've reintroduced fire that knocks some of those small stems back, and we enter into an understory reinitiation stage, where now we have small trees that are seedlings and saplings that then are going to enter into the canopy. And then we have this complex stage where we have these complex dynamics going on, which kind of represents kind of our target for restoration. Where we are along that gradient is going to dictate what specific techniques we may want to utilize as we develop our restoration plan, and that's going to determine how we evaluate how successful we are depending on at what stage of development. Second, while the goal of ecosystem restoration is to restore a natural ecosystem, the extent of anthropogenic disturbance can be so pervasive that nearly all available reference states will have been impacted to some degree by human activities. These need to be considered carefully and clearly articulated in your restoration plan when you describe your reference conditions. And in many instances, you may need to interpret how best to remove these human influences as you develop your reference conditions and design your restoration protocols to restore your degraded ecosystem. There may be instances, however, where the cultural aspects are important components that you'll wish to restore as well. And we'll discuss this idea and the idea of naturalness in other video lectures in this section.